The garlic has gone to a lovely creamy puree, like that. Now, the rest of the ingredients, we'll just get the garlic puree off of this for a second. The rest of the ingredients are, first of all, the juice of a lemon, so that's going to go in. And then we've got here a teaspoon of grain mustard, that's next. And then I've got anchovies. I've got 2 anchovies here that have been finely chopped. And if you don't like anchovies, just keep thinking Worcester sauce. And if you do like Worcester sauce, remember it's made with anchovies and they just give a lovely, lovely flavour. Then we've got capers. We've got a tablespoon of capers, which have been rinsed and chopped. You can use salted or vinegar capers. And then I've got parsley, tablespoon of parsley chopped, and a tablespoon of basil chopped. This is an Italian sauce. You can serve it with cold meats, you can serve it with plain grilled fish. It's a lovely sauce, and it's also quite a movable feast. You can vary the ingredients. It's very nice sometimes made with coriander instead of basil. Now we're going to use 2 tablespoons of quite good olive oil. I'd say extra virgin olive oil for this one. 1, 2. And then just give that a little whisk with this, which is a wonderful, lovely little whisk for salad dressings. And that's all ready now to assemble the dish, which is very simple and very easy. Now you need 1 1/4 pounds of potatoes that are cut into 1/4 inch slices. And then what's happened to these is they've been boiled for about 8 minutes, then the water's drained off, and you put a cloth over them to absorb the excess steam. Then you put a layer of potatoes in the base of the dish. 1 more there. Just give a little seasoning of salt and pepper. And then we're going to have the fish next. That goes on top of the potatoes. Like that. And then on top of the fish and the potatoes goes this beautiful sauce, which is going to give all that lovely sort of Italian Mediterranean flavour. Now just sort of flatten it out a little bit. And then finally, we're going to put the next layer of potatoes on the top. And you'll have more time than me, so you can be a little bit more careful in your decoration. That's it. Now, just a little bit more salt and pepper. And then finally, the top layer of potatoes has just a little brushing of olive oil. And that's going to make them nice and brown and crisp. And then the final Italian ingredient is this. This is Parmigiano Reggiano, Parmesan cheese, freshly grated, a tablespoon of that on the top. And that goes into a preheated oven, gas mark 6 or 400 degrees, put it on a high shelf, and it'll only take ½ an hour to cook. And there we are. The aroma is wonderful, and as you can see, there's lovely, crisp, crunchy potatoes on the top, and then underneath, lots of lovely, succulent fish with that rather special sauce. And what I would like to serve with that, apart from some chilled white wine, is a nice green salad with a lemony dressing. And then you've got the crispy potatoes and the lovely succulent fish underneath. I love this recipe here because it's so easy. It's all baked in the oven. First, you line a baking sheet with foil, brush it with melted butter, and then lay 4 place fillets on top. Then make a breadcrumb mixture in a food processor, adding 4 ounces of stale bread and fresh parsley and seasoning. After that, add 2 ounces of melted butter and 3 ounces of grated Parmesan cheese and mix very thoroughly. Spread the topping over the fish and bake it in the oven set to its highest setting on the highest shelf and give it 7 to 8 minutes.
Serve the fish just as it is, with fresh lemon juice squeezed over.
Well, when it comes to fish, one of the things the British really excel at, probably the best in the world at, is curing and smoking. For centuries we've been curing and smoking fish, and well, this one here, the first one I want to show you, is a kipper, and nobody can make a kipper like we can in Britain. And they can be grilled or fried or jugged just in hot water, but the best way to cook a kipper is in the open air on a barbecue. If you've never tried barbecued kippers, I suggest you do when the summer comes. Then we've got smoked haddock here. Now this is a nice big fat haddock, and traditionally finnan haddock is smoked on the bone like that. And I'm one of these people that I quite like eating fish on the bone. I think it has a lot of extra flavour, and that would be very nice with a couple of poached eggs on top. Next door, we've got something called an Arbroath smoky. Now this is a small haddock, and what they do is they hot smoke them for many hours so that they actually turn a lovely bronze colour, and the flavour is really smoky. You can just heat it up in a little cream with some brown bread and butter, and it's wonderful. These are called golden cutlets, and they have dye in them, which makes them the lovely yellow colour, but it's still the haddock, the tiny haddock, and that's also nice with the poached egg if you've got a smaller appetite than that one. And here is the haddock, just like this one, but this one's had the bone taken out, and this is undyed, so it's not so yellow. But beware, when you buy smoked haddock, make sure if it's undyed that it is a nice yellowy creamy colour, because sometimes it's not smoky enough, and I think if you're going to have smoked haddock you want to taste the smoke. And then finally, smoked salmon, the king of fish that's smoked and then thinly sliced. And one little tip I have to give you is when you're buying smoked salmon, always make sure that the little fat lines in the fish are thin. If you get really, really white stripy pieces of fat, then it's not good salmon.
This is a very luxurious version of fish pie made with smoked fish, and it would be very good for entertaining. Start by poaching undyed haddock fillet in milk with a bay leaf and seasoning for about 10 minutes, reserving the poaching liquid. Then flake the haddock pieces into a bowl along with kipper, Arbroath smoky, smoked salmon, chopped hard-boiled egg, cornichons and capers. Next, chop 3 tablespoons of parsley and add this to a white sauce that you've made with the poaching milk and finished off with single cream. Now add a tablespoon of lemon juice to the smoked fish before mixing in the parsley sauce. Transfer the mixture to a buttered baking dish and cover with creamy mashed potatoes made with crème fraîche. Then decorate the surface with a knife to make a pattern and sprinkle over a mixture of Gruyere and Parmesan cheese. Now bake on a high shelf in the oven for 30 to 40 minutes or until the top is nicely tinged and golden brown. And I have to say, this is absolutely yummy.
Now we're going to move on to a shellfish recipe, and probably one of the most popular shellfish of all are prawns. And these handsome little fellas I've got in front of me here, they're called tiger prawns, and if you have a problem getting them fresh, which is sometimes difficult, it doesn't matter if you buy them frozen, because provided they're thoroughly defrosted, they're just as good, and they're fat and juicy and have all the flavour of the sea. Now, I promised you when we were making Thai noodles I was going to show you how to prepare these prawns, and it's all very, very simple. All you do is pull off the head, which will come off very, very easily, as you can see, and then not at the back, but where the stomach and the legs are, you begin to just peel off the shell, and the legs and the shell will just come off very easily. It's easy as peeling an orange. There we are. Now I'm going to leave the tail on, and I'm going to show you how to butterfly a prawn now. We've got the tail intact, we've got the skin and the legs and the head off. So you just take a sharp knife, turn the prawn on its back, and then just go in with the knife and slit it open, but don't go all the way through. You don't want to cut it in half. And then, with your thumb, you can butterfly it. You can make it come out in a little triangle shape like that. Sometimes you find a little black thread in the middle there, which you need to scrape out. Then you need to wash that under a cold running tap. but I've got 5 here that are prepared already. And what's going to happen is they're going to have garlic butter put on top of them. Now what you can do is you can do these on a baking tray all together. You need 5 per person, and this is for 4, so you'd need 20 altogether. Or you can do them in little gratin dishes like this. And what you do is you just put the garlic butter, a little blob of garlic butter on top of each of the prawns. And what have I got in my garlic butter? I've got 3 ounces of butter. I've got the grated zest and juice of half a lemon. I've got a heaped tablespoon of chopped parsley and some salt and freshly milled pepper and 4 cloves of garlic, so it's quite garlicky. And then that will go into a preheated oven, which is 450 degrees, and they'll take about 6 to 7 minutes. How do you know when they're cooked? Because they sizzle. So, I'll just let you see one there. Send it to the table with a little bit of lemon to squeeze over, a sprinkling more of parsley, and what you need with all that lovely garlic buttery juices is lots of crusty bread.
There's just enough time to show you a couple more fish recipes. This is a wonderful recipe for Thai fish cakes, and they're served with a toasted sesame and lime dipping sauce. They're not only extremely good, but they're probably the fastest fish cakes in the world to make. This sounds very glamorous, tiger prawn risotto with lobster sauce. But it's actually a bit of a cheat because it's made with a jar of ready-made lobster bisque. And this one here is oven-roasted salmon with a crusty topping made with fresh pesto sauce, pecorino cheese and breadcrumbs.
Well, it's such a shame, isn't it, when we run out of time, but I do hope I've been able to take away some of the fears that you may have had about cooking fish. And I'll look forward to coming back next week to share with you some thoughts on meat.
Now we're going to look at how to cook meat. From traditional roast lamb to a very fast roast pork. There'll be a new angle on a beef stew and a good old-fashioned steak and kidney pie.
One thing I'm very proud of living in the British Isles is what good meat we have. In fact, I think we have the best meat in the world. There's so much hill country. You've got the Highlands of Scotland, the Welsh mountains, the lovely rolling hills of Devon and the Pennines, and you can't grow vegetables on hills, so we're very lucky that we have such wonderful meat, best in the world. And one thing I'd like to tell you about cooking meat is all you need to know is if you think of an animal, think of me, this half, that half. This half up here drags the other half along, so this does all the hard work, and this is the meat that's tougher and needs longer cooking, whereas the back part of the meat that doesn't have to do all the work is the most tender. So we're going to start with cooking a steak. I think that's the best thing to learn when you're starting to learn about meat, and the steak comes from the hind quarter, so it's tender and it doesn't need long, slow cooking. These are sirloin steaks, sometimes called entrecôte steaks, and you'll need about, well, depending on your appetite, between 6 to 8 ounces. And then I've trimmed most of the fat off but left a little bit on because it gives extra flavour when you're cooking. And you'll see also that there's a little bit of marbling of fat throughout the steak, and that's important because as the steak hits the heat, that little marbling of fat will melt a bit and give it more succulence and more flavour. Now what I do is trim some of the fat off, which I always give to my birds, and then just give the steaks a little bash like that with my fist, just to flatten them out a little bit and tenderise them. And then some coarsely milled pepper. But I'm not going to put any salt on because salt draws out juice and we want to keep the juice in, so I think it's important to actually salt the steaks afterwards. Now the best way, the very best way to cook a steak is in a frying pan. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. And I thought that I would cook the steaks and show you a very nice sauce to go with them. So in my frying pan here I've been cooking, it's going to be, the recipe is actually called Hungarian steak, and what I've done is I've got a small pepper that's been chopped small and 3 shallots, and they've just been cooked in a little bit of oil just to soften them. And what I'm going to do now is make the sauce later, and so I'm just going to remove them to a plate on the side here and then put my frying pan back on the highest heat. Now when you're going to cook a steak you do need to be very daring with the heat. You've got to get the pan as hot as you dare. And I'm just going to put a little tiny spot of oil in there because the pepper has used what I had. Just a teaspoonful is enough, just to moisten the pan. And then you leave the pan on the heat until you get it really, really shimmering hot. What we want to do is sear the steak on the outside, and it seizes up as it sears and keeps in all the lovely juices. So in go your steaks. And they should make a nice big sizzle like that. And then use a tablespoon and just press it down gently so that the surface of the steak will come into close contact with the heat of the pan. Now I told you I would tell you why a frying pan and not a grill. Well, while you're cooking steak, some of the juices will run out. We don't want them to run out, but some of them inevitably will. And if you cook them in a frying pan, you've got all the juice there, it's still in the pan at the end. And if you weren't making a sauce, as I'm going to make, and you just wanted plain steak, then when you turn it out onto your plate, you can spoon all those lovely meaty juices over the steak. Now, how do you like your steak cooked? I would say that they would need, if you want to eat your steak medium, they would need about 3 minutes each side. If you want them rare, 1.5 to 2 minutes each side, and if you want them well done, then 4 minutes each side. And sometimes it's a good idea to just put a timer on while you're doing steaks because, well, when you're my age, you get a bit absent-minded sometimes and forget how long they've been there. So now we're halfway through the cooking time, so we're going to turn the steaks over onto the other side, and you can see how nice and crisp and crusty they are. And then, because I want to show you this sauce, this Hungarian sauce to serve with the steak, I'm going to let them cook for a couple of minutes, and then 1 minute before the end I'm going to make the sauce. And then when you make the sauce, you put the onion and pepper back into the pan. Some of it can go on top of the steaks like that. And what I've got in my jug here is 6 fluid ounces of red wine, so that's going to go in next. And the red wine is going to bubble and reduce right down to a really syrupy consistency, which is going to take a little less than about a minute. Now you can see how that's bubbled down now and become quite syrupy, so it's going to have one more ingredient. And that is this, which is half-fat creme fraiche, wonderful cooking ingredient, behaves well with heat. And I'm just going to stir that into the sauce, which will make it thicker, and let it just bubble and reduce a bit more. And then just spoon the sauce over the steaks like that. And then have some hot serving plates ready. And then just put a little bit of paprika into the sauce. And what I'm going to do is just put a tiny bit over the top of the steak as well. Just let that stir in. All the time you're doing this, it's going down and down and getting more and more syrupy. So here we are, have a hot serving plate ready. Serve 1 steak per person, a little bit of sauce over the top, and garnish it, perhaps with a little bit of watercress before it goes to the table, and that would be lovely, with some lovely crunchy jacket potatoes and maybe a nice crisp green salad.
One of my most favourite ways to serve roast lamb is to plainly roast it and serve it with a Shrewsbury sauce. All it needs first is a good seasoning, and then as it roasts in a medium oven for about 30 minutes to each pound, baste it at least 3 times with the juices to keep it succulent. Test with a skewer to see how cooked it is. The pinker the juice, the rarer the meat. When it's cooked, leave it to rest, pour off the fat and make a sauce by stirring in flour and mustard powder to the juices. Next, add a pint of Beaujolais, and when it's incorporated, add red currant jelly, lemon juice and Worcester sauce. Add some seasoning and whisk until the jelly has completely dissolved. Then let the sauce bubble and reduce for about 15 minutes and serve it with the carved lamb.
Well, roasting a leg of lamb does take a little bit of time, but I'm now going to show you the fastest roast recipe that I've ever invented. This is called fast roast fillet of pork with rosemary and caramelised apples, and you're not going to believe just how quickly you can make this. Well, you start off with fillet of pork, and fillet is the lovely sort of juicy bit that comes when you see a pork chop, the bit in the middle, and when it's boned out it looks like this. We've got 2 pieces of fillet of pork. They're both weighing about 12 ounces. And what I've been doing here is putting garlic into it. I've got 2 cloves of garlic, or I had 2 cloves of garlic. What I did was took the skin off and cut the garlic into very thin, wafer-thin slices like that. And then all over the pork, both sides, I've made little slits with a sharp knife. Then just sort of pull the slit open with your finger and then just pop the little bits of garlic and press them into those little pockets. So 2 cloves of garlic in all. Now, that's my first flavouring. My second flavouring is rosemary. And you need a tablespoon of rosemary leaves. Rosemary has a lovely affinity with pork. And the first thing you do when you strip the leaves from the stem is you put it into a mortar, and then you go in quite heftily, because what you want to do is crush the rosemary leaves just to release all their lovely aromatic oils and flavours. And this is called bruising, actually. This is called, when you see a recipe and it says bruise the rosemary, this is what that means. And then when you've done that, you tip the rosemary out onto a chopping board and you chop it very finely so that it ends up like that. Now, the next stage of the recipe is you need to have 1½ ounces of butter melted and mixed with 1½ tablespoons of this, which is cider vinegar. So you've got the butter and the lovely sharp flavour of the apples in the cider vinegar. And you brush the pork fillet with the mixture and then sprinkle the chopped rosemary leaves all over the surface of the pork. And we're going to use approximately half the chopped rosemary, and when it goes onto the top of the pork, pat it down like that. Then use some freshly milled pepper and salt. Turn it over on the other side and do exactly the same on the other side. Brush it first, then sprinkle with the chopped rosemary, and that's now all ready. We go over to a baking tray, and the baking tray has been fairly well buttered, and the first thing I'm going to do, it's a good solid roasting tray. You need a really good solid one for this recipe. I'll tell you why in a minute. You sprinkle a small chopped onion onto the tray, and then you place the pork fillet on top of the onion. And then here I've got apples. I've got 3 Granny Smith apples, and they have been brushed with the rest of the butter and cider vinegar mixture. And once you've cored the apples, you cut them into 6 wedges from each apple, and I'm going to put them around the pork. Then you sprinkle the rest of the rosemary onto the apples. And I've discovered pork and apples have always gone well together, pork and rosemary, but pork, apples and rosemary is really 3 ingredients that really are made for each other. Now, I said caramelised apples, so the caramel will be in the shape of demerara sugar that goes onto the top of the apples like that. And the fast roasting, which is why you need a solid baking tray, means that you preheat the oven to its very highest setting, 450 degrees, and then you pop the pork and the apples into the oven, and it's going to take only 25 minutes to cook. Well, when you remove the pork from the oven, one thing is very important to remember, and that is to give it some resting time before you carve it. So remove the pork and apples to a warm serving dish, cover them with foil. When you're roasting meat, what happens is the juices all bubble up to the surface in the heat of the oven, and when you give it this resting time, the juices have time to sort of seep back, and then you get more juicy meat. Now, after that, what I did was scrape all the sort of debris from the baking tray into my saucepan here, and all the little bits of caramelised onion. And what I did was I put the baking tray over a heat with a little bit of cider and just scraped it all off. Now, the sauce is going to be a cider sauce, and the first measurement of this, I used a bit already, but it was 8 fluid ounces of dry cider, and that's going to go in to join the baking tray scrapings. And I'm going to give it a little whisk there and turn the heat right up, because what I want now is for that to bubble and reduce down to about 2/3, sorry, of its original volume. And that's going to take about 5 minutes. And now the cider has reduced down and become quite syrupy, and the smell is wonderful. It smells like an apple loft here. I'm now going to add this wonderful sauce ingredient, which is half-fat creme fraiche. That's going to go in, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a whisk and bring it back to a simmering point, and then the sauce is now ready to be poured over the meat.
What happens when you let meat rest is that all the juices that bubble up to the surface are allowed to soak back into it, and you can see just how succulent it is. I prefer to cut the meat thickly in slices like this, which are called medallions, rather than thinly sliced. Now you've got to think real luxury here. Prime fillet steak, encased with a wild mushroom filling and wrapped in just a whisper of crisp puff pastry. Begin by taking some dried porcini mushrooms and soak them in hot water for about 20 minutes. While that's happening, finely chop open cap mushrooms and some onion in a food processor. Then chop the porcini finely too and sauté the whole lot in butter. Mix everything round to get a good buttery coating, then season with a few gratings of fresh nutmeg, add some salt and freshly milled black pepper, and then cook on the very lowest heat for about 35 minutes until all the liquid evaporates and the mixture is quite dry. Now to cook the fillet steaks, sear them in a hot pan for just 30 seconds on each side so that they're browned but not actually cooked. Then turn off the heat, but don't wash the pan yet. As soon as the steaks are cold, brush them with brandy, season and place them on some of the mushroom mixture which is spread on a square of puff pastry. Then put a little more mushroom mixture on the top. Now glaze around the pastry with beaten egg and then fold opposite corners of the pastry in to overlap in the centre, rather like an envelope, but be careful to seal the pastry gently and then brush it all with beaten egg. Cook them in a hot oven for 25 minutes for medium rare, or 5 minutes more or less if you like them rare or well done. While the steaks are cooking, scrape the pan and add any remains of the mushroom mixture and red wine. Let all this bubble and reduce by about 1/3 until it becomes syrupy, and then spoon a little round each portion as it goes to the table. So this is mini boeuf en croûte, and remember when you're serving it to serve it straight away because the steak does go on cooking inside the pastry. Well, that was fast meat. Now we're going to go from fast to slow, and I want to talk to you about slow cooking meat, or more specifically, casseroling. Now, this meat comes from the forequarter, the bit of the animal that does all the work dragging the rest along. Now, it is tougher, but this has a great advantage too, because something develops in the working, and that's called connective tissue. What that does is, in the long, slow cooking process, it begins to melt, and it enriches the flavour and the succulence of the meat. So slow cooking is just as good as fast cooking, and it doesn't involve your time. It doesn't take you any longer. It just means that you go away and leave it in the oven for 2 hours. So I'm a great champion of casseroling. Now, I want to show you probably one of the most popular British traditional casserole dishes of all, and that is steak and kidney. Steak and kidney that's later on going to go into individual steak and kidney pies. Now, the meat you use for this is something called chuck steak. It's chuck or blade steak that you need for this. And the other ingredient is ox kidney. Now, when you're doing steak and kidney, sometimes you find steak and kidney pies in supermarkets and they haven't got ox kidney, they've got lamb kidney or they've got pig kidney. But no, we're going to keep everything full of beefy flavour, so it must be ox kidney. So, the first thing I want to show you when you're actually going to make a casserole, or in this case some steak and kidney, is the most important bit is browning the meat. Now what I've done here is the meat is cut up into bite-sized 1-inch cubes, and the kidney is cut up into very, very tiny pieces. The kidney is there to give lots of wonderful richness and flavour to the sauce, but you don't want lumps of kidney. It just sort of melts into it, if you know what I mean. And what you need to do, first of all, is brown the meat that's going to go in the casserole. And to do this, you use beef dripping. As I say, we're keeping everything very beefy. Put about a tablespoon of beef dripping. Get the pan really, really hot. And we're using 2 pounds altogether. But what you need to learn, and this is the most important lesson you need to learn about casseroling, is when you're browning meat, you can only put
5 pieces of meat at a time in your cooking pot. You need to have the heat very hot too. If you put more than that and you overcrowd the pan, lots of steam comes out. I mean, you can see in there is steam coming out. And when all that steam comes out, what it does is it creates a bath of steam, and you'll never brown it in a million thousand years. So I'm very good, I think, at giving you lots of shortcuts, but this time I'm saying don't try to short circuit this one. Keep with it, stay with the meat, and it'll take probably about 10 minutes to brown it all together, because what you want to have is a lovely nutty, crusty edge, as we had when we were cooking the steaks. Because if you get that crusty brown edge, that's going to give flavour to your casserole, but it's also going to seal in the juices. And then when all the meat is browned, like this, you add it in the casserole to join the rest. And here I've got 8 ounces of roughly chopped onions, and they've been browned as well, and it's important with the onion to get the onion nice and brown, because that, again, the browning is what's going to give us all that lovely flavour. And the whole point of cooking is to get as much flavour as you can out of ingredients. So the onion goes back in to join the meat, and then I've already cooked the kidney a little bit as well. That's been cooked, so that can go in. Now I'm going to add some mushrooms, because mushrooms give good flavour. And also, for those of you out there going, oh, I don't want to eat kidney, I know there are some of you that are never going to want to eat kidney. So what you can do is replace the amount of kidney and have all mushrooms. But this one's going to have all 3. So in go the mushrooms. That gets stirred around. And then, when you're making a casserole, it's going to be served in a lovely thick sauce. And the way to achieve a lovely thick sauce is to use flour. First of all, though, I'm going to add some pepper and salt, a good seasoning, a very good seasoning of pepper and salt. And I'm just going to put a little bit of thyme, half a teaspoon of chopped thyme leaves, which will give a nice flavour. And I've got 2 tablespoons of flour. So the meat's cooking gently, and there's a little bit of fat in there, so the flour will be absorbed by the fat. So just sprinkle it in, then go back with a wooden spoon and stir the flour in. Now this is the time when, if you're a beginner making a casserole, that you're likely to panic, because you always think, oh, flour, lumps, and actually when you look at it now, it actually doesn't look very promising. But I promise you, you'll have to trust me, I promise you that there's nothing wrong. The flour just gets absorbed into the fat, and this is what's going to give us a lovely creamy sauce. So there we are, the flour's been absorbed now. Next thing is stock, and I've got a pint of beef stock here, and this is ready-made instant beef stock that you buy in the supermarket, and I've enriched it with 2 tablespoons of Worcester sauce. So that goes in next. Add a bit at first, and I'm going to turn the heat back up now. What we want now is for this all to come up to simmering point. And then as soon as it comes up to simmering point, we'll add the rest now. What you then do is you put a lid on the casserole, and the easiest way, you could cook it on top of the stove if you wanted to, if you've got a stove that can really, really gently cook. But I find it's quite easy to just pop it in the oven, and the oven temperature for that will be 140 degrees, so that the liquid only just bubbles, just a bubble just breaks the surface every now and again, and that will take exactly 2 hours. Well, one of the nicest ways, I think, to serve a steak and kidney pie is in individual portions. And what I've got here are little heat-proof soup bowls, and I've divided the mixture between 6 of these. And then short crust pastry we made in part 1, we don't need to talk about that. But what I've done is I've rolled out a lid to fit the top using a saucer to cut it out, to fit the top. And then the trimmings of the pastry I've rolled out to form a strip. So what I'm going to do first of all is just dampen the edge of the of the dish like this and put the little pastry strip round. And of course what I'm using here is short crust pastry, and that is important. I think that's the best one for steak and kidney pie because the filling is so rich. You don't want a fatty puff pastry or a rich pastry. Then I'm going to just brush the edges of that with some water. Put the lid on, and this is quite a sort of haphazard affair. It doesn't have to look sort of prim and perfect. And all you do now is just squeeze the lid on to the other piece of pastry, quite hard. And then you take a knife and you just knot the edges up like that to make them look sort of layery. And then all I do is use my fingers, use my thumb and my forefinger and just make it into a little pattern round the edge. I think the nicest thing about this is it looks rustic. Make a steam hole in the centre, then just put a little bit of beaten egg on the top of the pastry, which is going to give it a lovely golden glow when it comes out of the oven. Preheat the oven fairly hot, 425 degrees. Put 6 of these on a baking tray, pop them into the oven, and they'll take 25 minutes to cook.
Now I've just got time to share with you my own particular favourite shepherd's pie, and this one's topped with mashed potatoes, melted cheese and leeks. This is a new twist on a beef stew. This is Latin American beef stew, and it's cooked with sweet corn, squash, red pepper, chilies and lots of lovely spices. And then it's garnished with slices of red onion marinated in lime juice and coriander. Time for one more. This is Spanish pork, slowly braised with tomatoes, thyme, red wine and olives, with potatoes added in at the end.
Well, sadly half an hour isn't quite enough time to talk about a huge subject like cooking meat. But anyway, until we get longer cookery programmes, that is all I've got time for. But I hope to see you next time.
This time we're looking at chicken and other birds. We're going to be making a Spanish paella with chicken. We're going to be roasting a duck with a lovely crispy skin and serving it with sour cherry sauce. But the most special part of the programme is how to fast roast a chicken.
Well, I've got quite a lot to say about roast chicken actually. And the first and most important thing I want to say is when you're going to roast a chicken, What you need most of all is the best flavoured chicken you can buy. Before you cook it, it's got to have good flavour.
I can only obviously speak as a cook, but it has to be said that although mass-produced chicken is widely available and very cheap, what has been lacking in the last couple of decades is real old-fashioned chicken with all the glorious richness and flavour it was meant to have. The very best flavoured chicken is obviously going to be free range and lead a totally natural life. On this farm in Essex, the chickens have shelter. They have bales of straw to roost on, they have a large meadow to roam in, and plenty of grain if they need to top up their diet, and lots of fresh water. And the chickens breathe fresh air day and night. But this is only half the story. Chickens should not be specially bred for fast growing. They need to be allowed to grow quite naturally. These chickens here have twice the lifespan of the mass-produced birds. Be warned though, there are complicated labelling laws, and if you want a truly free-range chicken, you need to look for additional words which are either total freedom or traditional free-range. And the traditional way to deal with chicken is to dry pluck it and then allow it to hang completely intact without removing the innards. If this is allowed to happen in controlled temperatures, the flavour naturally develops. Now with mass-produced chicken, these are gutted and plunged into scalding water in order to mechanically remove